Good morning. Kia ora, everyone. Good early morning to you all. Welcome to session 4. I hope that you are all well. Morning. So today, yes, session 4, and we have 2 guest speakers with us, Catherine and Rob. And I will introduce Catherine in a minute, but before we start the content, as usual, we will just start with a karakia. Manawa mai te mori nuku, manawa mai te mori rangi, ko te mori ke o he mori tupua, ke pakaru mai te pō, tau mai te mori, homi e, hui e, tai ki e. So welcome back, Rob. We're delighted to have you with us again. And I'm also very delighted to introduce Catherine, who is a very experienced trade negotiator and a trade policy expert. She was a diplomat for New Zealand, posted in New York, I think, Geneva, part of the UN, has worked at the World Trade Organization and the International Labour Organization negotiations, and has been involved in trade policy development and trade negotiations on behalf of the private sector. So she's a very well recognized researcher. We are delighted to have you with us. Welcome, Catherine. I don't know if you want to just say hi and something about yourself.
Yeah, no, thanks, Suzanne. Kia ora, everybody. As Suzanne said, my name's Catherine Grant-Makakira, and I'm really pleased to be joining you this evening, New Zealand time, this morning, in most parts of Africa. I'll be here today and then hopefully also coming along to see you again next week and probably one more time after that. In addition to working for the New Zealand government, I've also spent quite a large part of the last 20 odd years in and around Southern and Eastern Africa. So I'm really excited to be part of this particular training course because certainly African trade is something that I'm really excited to be talking about and looking forward to exchanging views with many of you as we go through the session tonight. Thanks.
Thanks, Catherine. So now, my voice, I will hand over to you, Rob, for the first part of the session.
All right. I don't seem to be showing up on the screen, but I guess that won't matter once I share the screen. So let me just begin by sharing my screen. Hold on, I've just got to find my... Right, there we go. And we will slideshow starting from the beginning. Right, so there we are. We're sharing the screen. Good morning, everybody. I'm very happy to be with you again, and even more happy to be joined by Catherine for this session, because we're going to be talking about regional trade agreements, by which we mean, of course, free trade agreements, customs unions, and common markets. And we want to focus quite heavily on the development of regional trade agreements in Africa, involving your countries, and also the issues around these agreements in Africa. So I'm going to speak briefly at the start of the session, maybe for half an hour or a bit more, introducing the topic, and then I'm going to hand over to Catherine, who is an expert on trade in Africa, as she just mentioned, and we'll talk to you about what is happening in Africa around regional trade agreements, free trade agreements, and of course the great African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Okay, so first of all, just a quick run through the different types of regional trade agreements that we can find in the world, because they all have different characteristics, they all have different issues around them. And so we can start with what we sometimes call a preferential trade agreement, where the countries involved in the agreement, we've got A and B, country A and country B in this diagram, reduce the barriers on trade between each other, but don't remove the barriers. So we have, for example, country A having trade barriers of 10% on imports from country B, 5% on imports from country A, but country A has got a 10% tariff on imports from the rest of the world, and country B also has a 20% tariff on imports from the rest of the world. So there is a reduction in tariff, at least from country B, instead of a 20% tariff on imports from the rest of the world. Country B is levying a tariff of only 5% on imports from country B. So this is a partial free trade agreement, you might say, and the rules that we have in the trading system, which are again the basic WTO rules, which set out in GATT Article 24, in fact, they don't allow this type of preferential trade agreement involving developed countries. So developed countries can't, under WTO rules, have this kind of agreement, because under the WTO rules, they have to eliminate the trade barriers between themselves, between the members of the agreement, on substantially all trade between them, and do that within a reasonable period of time. So this kind of agreement is not really open for developed countries, but it is available for developing countries under a special provision known as the Enabling Clause, and also something else called GATT Part 4, which allows this type of agreement when only developing countries are involved. And there are many, many examples of this in practice. So that brings us then to the most common type of trade agreement that we see around the world, which is the free trade area, or the FTA. And this is where the members do remove the trade barriers on trade among themselves, on substantially all the trade among themselves, and they retain their separate barriers against the rest of the world. So we have many, many examples all around the world of free trade agreements, free FTAs. It's the most common type of agreement that we see in the rest of the world. So we have here country A imposing the tariff of 0 on country B, and country B imposing a tariff of 0 on country A, while both of them are keeping higher barriers on the countries in the rest of the world. 10% from country A on imports from country C, and 20% by country B on imports from country C as well, with country C representing the rest of the world. So as I've just said, the rules in the WTO say that a free trade agreement must involve eliminating the trade barriers, as country A and country B have done here, on substantially all the trade within a reasonable period of time, and also that the countries involved in the FTA are not allowed at the same time to increase their barriers against imports from the rest of the world, represented here by country C. So that's probably the type of agreement that you're most familiar with, but I do need to just stop for a minute to talk about some very special arrangements that we have in the system for developing countries. I've talked about GATT Part 4 and Enabling Clause of 1979, which allow more flexible agreements between developing countries, but they also allow developed countries to give one-way partial preferences, what we call non-reciprocal preferences, to all developing countries or to a group of developing countries. And so we have the Generalized System of Preference, or GSP, which under which many developed countries offer developing countries reduced tariffs on, or sometimes a removal of tariffs on their imports from the developing countries. So GSP is quite important for a number of developing countries. It's a particular market entry facilitating device, which helps many developing countries get access to developed country markets. And we also have some very important agreements, which I think are quite probably very important for African countries as well as countries in my part of the world. The European Union's Everything But Arms arrangement, and the United States African Growth and Economic Opportunities Act, or AGOA, they are both covered by this provision, allowing developed countries to give one way or non-reciprocal, in other words, not requiring the developing countries to reciprocate, giving them preferences which may or may not involve reducing their tariffs all the way to 0. Developing countries do, under these arrangements, can give also partial two-way preferences to each other, as we've just seen. They don't have to eliminate barriers on substantially all trade under Article 24. But this provision, as I just mentioned on the previous slide, is not available if developed countries are involved in the agreement. And another point that's worth just noting is that there is no enabling clause in the rules for trade and services. So this is only for trade and goods. We then move on to the customs union, which is a slightly more challenging type of agreement, where the members, again, like in the free trade area, have to remove trade barriers among themselves. So A and B both have zero tariffs on each other, but they agree on a common external tariff against imports from the rest of the world. So whereas in the previous examples, we've seen country A with tariffs of 10% on country C and the rest of the world, while country B had tariffs of 20%. In this case, we see they've agreed that they will both have tariffs at 15% on imports from country C and the rest of the world. And that's the point of the customs union, that the two countries harmonise their tariffs on imports from the rest of the world, here 15% each. And that is actually quite difficult to do because it means that they have to agree on this common external tariff. And typically we find that each country's tariffs that they had, the 10% tariffs of country A and the 20% tariffs for country C, had very particular purposes and were designed to support particular industries that have come to rely on them. And so governments will face quite a lot of pressure, particularly country B here, which has reduced its tariff of 20% to the common external tariff level of 15%. It's probably, country B would probably face quite a lot of pressure from businesses in its country who will not be welcoming this common external tariff of 15%. So the difficulty of getting agreement between the members of a customs union on the common external tariff explains why we have relatively few examples. The biggest example, of course, is the European Union, which, among many other things, is a customs union. But that was very difficult for them to get started also, because there were a number of countries in the original European community that were happy to have a common external tariff for industrial goods. But there were other countries who were very, very firm that they wanted much higher tariffs for agricultural goods. And there was no possibility of getting an agreement on a common external tariff for agricultural goods. And the solution to that was to create the common agricultural policy of the European Union. So that was why the common agricultural policy of the European Union was imposed on the European Union itself and on the rest of the world. In terms of other customs unions, there is the Mercosur agreement between Brazil and Argentina, Paraguay and Uruguay. There's the Eurasian customs union involving Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan. There's the Southern African Customs Union in Africa, but there are not many other customs unions around the world. It's not an easy arrangement to get put in place. And it does mean that once you have the customs union, the members have to negotiate jointly with the external partners as a single negotiating team. And in terms of any rules, that we once again have the rules to remove barriers on substantially all trade, but also another rule is that the common external tariff must, on average, not be higher than the average of the tariffs of the two countries before the union. So if we move into more complex or more complete integration, we move on to the common market, which the European Union calls its single market. It's a common market, and that involves the features of a customs union, plus free movement of labour and free movement of capital between the members. And it also involves free trade and services, if that wasn't previously agreed under a free trade agreement or a customs union. And the European Union is, I guess, the best known example and the most complete example of a common market. We also see common markets set up in the Caribbean, less complete. CARICOM, the Central American Common Market, in Southeast Asia, the ASEAN Economic Community, and the two countries in Australasia, Australia and New Zealand, also have the ambition to develop their free trade agreement and CETA into a single economic market. And in Latin America, we also have the Andean community. Going much further than a common market, of course, is what the European Union has done to coordinate its fiscal and welfare policies, monetary, fiscal and welfare policies, to adopt common economic laws and standards, and to adopt a single currency for most of the members. Not all of them, but most of the members of the European Union have adopted the euro as their currency. So this is what we call an economic union, which is the most challenging, I guess, form of economic integration, because to, first of all, have a single currency means that you have to have a single monetary policy. It's pretty well impossible to have a successful single currency as a single monetary policy without having coordinated fiscal and welfare policies, as the European Union found out through the hard way, and also the adoption of common economic laws and standards. So it's a very complex, complete type of integration, which so far probably only the European Union has gone the full way, although we do see initiatives to create currency unions or attempted economic unions in the Eastern Caribbean, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, in West Africa, in Central Africa, in Southern Africa, and also in East Africa. So the African countries have probably, outside Europe, are probably the part of the world that has been most interested in moving to common markets, moving to economic union. Though I'm not sure that any complete economic union exists in Africa as yet, and no doubt Catherine will talk about that in her session shortly. Some people say that once you get on this path from customs union to common market to economic union, it's almost inevitable that will set up pressures that will lead to political union. The European Union is a kind of a guinea pig for that. There is obviously some political integration within the European Union with the Brussels bureaucracy and the European Parliament, but a complete political union within the European Union still seems a long way off. And there are, I think, many countries who would probably be very determined to avoid getting to that point. So another diagram here that explains also what I've just said. If we move along the horizontal here, moving from a reduction of tariffs between the members to complete removal of tariffs between the members, to also having a common external tariff, and then having capital and labour movement, free capital and labour movement among the members, and finally common economic policies and a common currency. Moving that way horizontally, we're moving downwards from the preferential trade arrangement to the free trade area, to the customs union, to the common market, and then to the economic union. Now, one quite important question that has to be asked, of course, is are these arrangements always beneficial for the countries that are involved in that? And this is an issue that has been debated very long and hard among trade economists. We do accept in trade theory that unilateral reduction of trade barriers, that's countries on their own reducing their trade barriers, and multilateral trade liberalisation, that is a worldwide move to lower trade barriers, will have unambiguously positive effects on the economic welfare of the countries concerned, and also on the welfare of the world as a whole. Can we take a further step and say that the welfare effects of these preferential or regional trade agreements are also unambiguously positive? And the answer is, well, we don't. It depends on the facts. There is no clear-cut answer to that question, and this is where an economic theory known as the theory of the second best emerged, which is a theory of what is the best thing you can do if you can't do what we consider to be the first best, which would be global free trade in the case of trade. So the answer to that question then, in terms of a free trade agreement or a preferential trade agreement, is that if there are industries where the partner country or the partner countries are internationally competitive, the effects of removing the trade barriers on imports from the other partners are unambiguously welfare enhancing. They do increase welfare. That's what we call pure trade creation. But if we have industries where the partner country or countries are not internationally competitive, then we have two effects. We have trade creation, which is the welfare enhancing gains from trade. It eliminates protection, the integration eliminates protection among the member countries and allows them to specialize in trade according to their comparative advantage and exploit potential economies of scale. But we also have trade diversion, which is welfare reducing. The diversion of trade from non-members to members caused by the discrimination inherent in integration. So you have a non-member who is the most efficient, lowest cost supplier of, say, motor cars to your country, but because you've retained your trade barriers, trade tariffs on imports from that non-member, but you have eliminated your tariffs on imports from your partner, it turns out that consumers can buy your their car from your partner more cheaply than from your previous supplier. And that's what we call trade diversion, which is welfare reducing. It is reducing the economic welfare of the partner countries. And I will be happy to explain that a little bit further if anybody would like me to do so. But this is a very clear conclusion from the analysis of regional trade agreements. And so the general conclusion to the question that I put on the previous slide is that in terms of can preferential trade agreements or regional trade agreements be guaranteed to improve the economic welfare of their members? Well, the answer is actually no, it depends. And the condition for increasing welfare is that trade creation dominates trade diversion, that there is more trade creation than trade diversion from the provisions of the agreement, while if trade diversion dominates trade creation, the agreement is going to be making the countries as concerned worse off. And a very good example comes from my own country and Australia, who from the mid-1930s had a very highly protectionist trade policy. Most industries in Australia and New Zealand, except agriculture, were very heavily protected. And an earlier initial free trade agreement between the two countries, the New Zealand-Australia FTA, aimed to keep in place all that existing protection against imports from the outside world. So it was very trade diverting. It meant that it encouraged trade between the two countries when their industries were really seriously uncompetitive in relation to the rest of the world. So it was an agreement that almost certainly reduced the economic welfare of Australia and New Zealand. In the mid-1980s, the situation in both countries changed. They became less protectionist. They dramatically reduced the protection of their domestic industries through a process of unilateral trade liberalisation. And they ditched the New Zealand-Australia FTA and replaced it with a new trade agreement called ANCERTA, the Australia and New Zealand Closer Economic Relations Trade Agreement, which, because Australia and New Zealand had dramatically reduced their protection of domestic industries, meant that most of the new trade being created between Australia and New Zealand by ANCERTA was likely to be trade creation. So it was we replaced a predominantly trade diverting agreement with a predominantly trade creating agreement. And that's sort of an example of many, there are many examples of that sort of thing around the world. So just finally, given that we've seen so many changes in what we call the rules-based world trading system, the multilateral trading system based on the WTO, because the multilateral trading system is not working as well as it is supposed to do, does this change our outlook on free trade agreements? Do we come to different conclusions on the effects of preferential trade agreements, regional trade agreements, free trade agreements, because of the malfunction, if you like, in the world trading system? Do we come to different conclusions than we would come if the multilateral trading system was working better? So that when things were working well, there was general agreement that multilateralism was the first best foundation for a rules-based international trading system. Preferential trade agreements or regional trade agreements, which violated the fundamental principle of non-discrimination, were very much a second best, and maybe not even a best at all. And there was a very long and acrimonious debate among trade economists as to whether preferential trade agreements, regional trade agreements, even though they were imperfect, could have negative consequences, whether they could still be building blocks for a better multilateral trading system by you perhaps finish up joining together all those preferential trade agreements was one idea, or were they actually stumbling blocks by getting involved in these preferential or regional trade agreements? Did that distract or divert or even disincentivize countries from giving their commitment to the multilateral trading system? So that was the debate in the past. Today, the international environment for global trade is very much, even in the multilateral system, very much a second best environment itself. The multilateral system is not working as it's supposed to, and we saw some of the reasons for that when I talked about the perfect storm hitting the global trading system in the first session. And I've also highlighted how the WTO has been struggling to reflect the new realities of international trade because their members have been unable to come to agreement on new rules for the new realities. Most of the rules and commitments haven't been updated since the end of the Uruguay round in 1993. But while the pressure has been growing from businesses in particular for rules that will address the new issues that have emerged in international trade, and these are increasingly being met in negotiations for what we sometimes call deep free trade agreements that go much further than simply trade in goods and maybe sometimes trade in services. So today's free trade agreements generally take the WTO rules as their foundation, which is why the WTO remains one of the reasons why the WTO remains very important, but they go further and deeper. They, at the same time, leaving quite significant elements of unfinished business, but they do go further and deeper. The unfinished business, of course, in areas like services trade, agricultural trade, much to the annoyance of probably many of your countries as well as my country, subsidies, state-owned enterprises. These are elements of unfinished business that are even left behind by today's free trade agreements, but they do go further and deeper than the WTO rules. And then we now have what we call mega regional free trade agreements. In my part of the world, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, and the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, both commit large groups of countries in my part of the world to a rules-based approach to international trade, which is intended to be supportive of the WTO system. It's notable that the United States is not participating in either of these initiatives, which is sort of a significant issue for the world trading system. And of course, now in Africa, we have the emergence of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which again is a just like these two, the RCEP and CPTPP, mega regional agreements in the Asia Pacific. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement is now the new mega regional agreement in the African continent. So we can basically look at free trade agreements and how they've developed in terms of how they've become more complex. So we move to right from left to right across this diagram. The basic units of all regional trade agreements, including the mega regionals, are free trade areas or customs unions. And that's really because it goes back to the fact that these are the only forms of trade agreement that are authorized in the WTO rules under GATT Article 24. But there's nothing to stop countries from going much further than just free trade or customs union and building in many, many more features, which most modern preferential agreements, which we often call closer economic partnerships, typically do. So we'll find provisions on services, investment, competition, government procurement, trade facilitation, electronic commerce, intellectual property, and maybe in some labor, environment, and state-owned enterprises, although these are more controversial and are difficult to get included even in today's regional trade agreements. Key point about these provisions in any agreement is, are they enforceable? So you find many agreements which cover all these issues, but if you read the agreements carefully, you'll find that some of the chapters are subject to dispute settlement. That is, they are enforceable, but some of the chapters are explicitly not subject to dispute settlement. In other words, there is no sanction on members that break their commitments in this agreement. And in that case, what we're saying really is that that particular provision, say it was on labour or environment or state-owned enterprises, a provision that is not subject to dispute settlement is really a best endeavours commitment. We'll do our best to meet what the agreement says, but we're not going to commit ourselves legally to doing it. There's a lot of difference among these agreements in the amount of supranationality, the extent to which a supranational body like the European Commission in Europe has been set up to oversee the agreement. Some other agreements have this kind of feature, others don't, and also dispute settlement procedures. The NAFTA and now the USMCA agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico has quite extensive dispute settlement procedures. The agreement between Australia and New Zealand, in my part of the world, has no dispute settlement procedures, which has been a problem for us in the past. And also, there's also the question of the depth. We're talking about deep FTAs, but the depth actually varies. The depth depends on how many of these issues are covered, the horizontal depth, but also how deep do these specific provisions go, the vertical depth, and there are big differences between trade agreements on that feature. And we see in this graph how the trend towards deeper integration in free trade agreements seems to be connected to the spread of production network or global value chain trade. On the left-hand axis, we have an index of depth of agreements, which one trade economist created. On the other side, we have the production network trade in US billions of dollars. And we see that the depth of the agreements measured by the grey columns has steadily increased as the level of production network trade, represented by that crimson or red line, has also been going upwards. So as production network trade has increased, the depth of the agreements has also increased, and that reflects that production networks face business with a lot of new problems that they didn't face in orthodox trade, because they're now moving to set up businesses in other countries, link their businesses, their operations in different countries together, and that results in a demand for many other rules and provisions that will facilitate this kind of operation. Look at the new mega regionals. I've talked about, first of all, we have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was negotiated, including the United States, 12 countries, but the United States withdrew. And so we have 11 members in the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. We have the RCEP, which is an agreement among China, Japan, Korea, 10 Southeast Asian countries, and Australia and New Zealand. And we have the African Continental Trade Agreement, established in 2018. And in the Americas, there have been various attempts to create a mega regional, but these have not really succeeded. So there are also initiatives that connect major economic blocs. So, for example, the US and the EU tried or started negotiating an agreement, but that stopped when President Trump was elected. The European Union has created agreements with Japan, Canada, and Korea. So agreements with the other major economies around the world. There's been an attempt to negotiate a China, Japan, Korea free trade agreement, but that hasn't really gone very far. And we've also had in the Asia Pacific region a proposal for a free trade area of the Asia Pacific, which originally was supposed to include the TPP and the RCEP, but the withdrawal from the United States from the TPP has meant that the incentive for moving forward on the FTAAP is now much less than it was. And what we see in these mega regionals is a very strong focus on rulemaking, advanced rulemaking. So the countries that are members of these agreements are consciously, they know that they are setting up rules that eventually could become global trade rules. In some cases, they are intending that the rules that they set up within these mega regionals will become global trade rules, or they would like to see that happen. So there is a potential connection between the rules in these mega regionals and what may or may not become the rules for world trade in the future, and that adds an additional interest and certainly motivation in the negotiations for these mega regionals. The CPTPP and the RCEP are open to new members. So the CPTPP says it's an open plurilateral agreement which can be joined by other countries that accept its terms and conditions. The RCEP, which was initiated and managed by the Southeast Asian countries in ASEAN, is open to any country that is prepared to become an economic partner of ASEAN. And then finally, of course, we have China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is not a free trade agreement or a regional trade agreement. It's a quite different type of initiative, but it is a very important initiative in many parts of the world, especially in the developing world. And so we couldn't really talk about these mega regionals without also noting that China has this Belt and Road Initiative. There are concerns that these mega regionals, or particularly some of these mega regionals, are creating big economic blocks in major centres of economic activity. So the European Union has 27 members and 20% of world GDP. The North American Free Trade Agreement, now the USMCA, US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, has 28% of world GDP. And the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, accounts for 27% of world GDP. So these three major regions, Europe, North America, and East Asia, account for something like 75% of world GDP. And so the trade agreements between them are very significant, because the big question is, how open will they be to other countries that are not members of these agreements? And in general, European Union has become quite open after being quite protectionist in early years, particularly on agriculture. But there are questions that need to be asked about the North American agreement and also about the RCEP. How open will the members of these agreements be to the rest of the world, for example, to Africa? And of course, Africa now has its own block-making agreement, the African Continental Free Trade Area, ACFTA, which I guess as in some could be interpreted as a positive move to bring together the benefits of region-wide free trade, but perhaps also as a defensive move reacting to the creation of these other mega regionals and their potential effect on Africa. So the questions here, what does this all mean for global welfare? What does it mean for world trade rules? What does it mean for the economic benefits to the members of these different blocks when these are all put together and the whole impact on the world trading system is weighed up? Can we say, as Nobel Prize winning economist Paul Krugman said many years ago, that some trade blocks are natural trade blocks among countries that naturally trade a lot with each other and therefore probably not likely to be trade diverting? But that's a very contentious statement by Paul Krugman. Many economists disagree with him. And so there are questions about whether the splitting of the world into these major blocks is actually good for the world trading system as a whole. And I think that's a good point for me to stop. I have more slides, but I'm not going to present them today. I've called them Exploring Further Topics, which will go on Canvas with the slides. And so you can follow the additional topics if you wish by going to the slides on Canvas. So I will stop now, and I think, Suzanne, it's a good time for a break.
Thank you, Rob. Yes, I think it's a good time for a break. So we'll have a break until past. Is that right? Yes, we'll have a break until past. And then we will see you back here for Catherine's session. So it's 18 minutes from now. Thank you. Okay, well, it is past, so hopefully people are back now. So yes, I'll hand over to you, Catherine.
Thanks, Suzanne, and thanks, Rob, and hi again, everybody. I'm going to take a slightly different approach to regional trade agreements and build on what Rob has already spoken about more from a theoretical and legal perspective, and really start to look at why we may enter into regional trade agreements from a political economy point of view, and also what that has looked like in the African context over recent years. I'm very happy to take questions as I go. So I know that, you know, a lot of you are there listening closely to this, but if you do have a question at any point, feel free to raise your hand or to put it into the chat. And if I don't see it straight away myself, I'm hoping that maybe Suzanne or Antonia or somebody will pick it up for me. But yes, I'm very happy to take some engagement, because it's great to see a few familiar names actually in amongst the participants there today. And I know that many of you will have input that will be helpful on this topic. So after I've made some preliminary observations, we are going to go into the breakout sessions, as Rob indicated earlier. Okay, is this going to work for me? Yes, here we go. Hopefully you can all see my screen with no problems. So what I'll talk about a little bit in this first part of today's session is, again, as I said, touching on more political reasons that we look at integration of regional trade agreements, what some of those challenges are. These are challenges that are not unique to the African context at all, but I will focus on examples from Africa, and we will talk a little bit about particularly examples of customs unions and free trade areas. As Rob mentioned, these are sort of the fundamental building blocks that we see in the RTAs that exist today. We'll touch briefly on common markets and monetary unions as well. We might be able to have some time to get into the African continental free trade area. If we don't quite get there in this first part, then we will certainly try and come back to that either later today or next week. All these slides will be shared with you, so you can certainly refer to them as well at your leisure. And I've also got a couple of other readings that I'll make sure we put up on Canva for you to access if you want to get a little bit more deeper into any of these issues. Okay, right. So we've already spoken a little bit about why and how regional trade agreements are formed, and Rob's given you some good pointers there around things like trade creation, trade diversion, and so on. But from a political point of view, I think it's important to understand as well that there are other drivers often, particularly for seeking out trade arrangements with your neighbours, and they can relate both to economic issues, but also to more political objectives, or even security and peace objectives as well. And we'll talk through those when we come to some of the examples. From an economic point of view, many African markets are relatively small, as you will know. And so there is limited growth potential within those small markets. So certainly regional integration is something that can make economies more viable. And they are, from that point of view, also particularly important from the perspective of private sector actors. What we know about the business community is, and certainly what we know about exporting firms, is that many start out their journey as exporters within a neighbourhood, and that opportunities for trade and investment within regional blocks, particularly those that are geographically located close to each other, are much easier for small and medium-sized enterprises to take advantage of. And the majority of the private sector within the African continent is definitely within that small and medium size bracket, if not informal traders. And there are aspects about regional trade arrangements that are quite critical for the informal sector as well. I think points that I know that were covered in earlier sessions about the current global environment for trade also make these regional trade agreements very appealing right now. We've seen global uncertainties put into sharp relief some of the challenges that we have at a worldwide level, and the need for making sure that we can diversify our trading relationships and locate certain key aspects of production within our neighborhoods as well, if we're going to be facing similar challenges such as the COVID-19 pandemic or the geopolitical uncertainties brought on by things like the Russia-Ukraine conflict that's ongoing. So just going a little bit more into this idea that regional integration is also something that the business community can benefit from. And this is a fairly old report from the Boston Consulting Group about doing business in the African context. But I like it because it really quotes directly a lot of business leaders who are engaged in trying to trade across borders in the African context. And we still don't have many sources that do that. Some of the points that are made are about things that really I think we need to make sure we keep in mind when we're talking about trade, because it's not just tariffs, as you all well know, it's things like transport costs that are critical. We've started to touch upon trade facilitation. We'll be getting more into trade facilitation as well. Visas, so immigration issues. How do you actually move around when you're doing business, when you're trading between countries? This idea that markets are very fragmented, very small. So how do you then start to tackle the opportunities that might exist, but there could be, for example, many different regulatory requirements for your same one product in these different small markets. So all of these things are, again, issues that I think help generate the interest in regional trade agreements in the African context. We are seeing a strong push ahead to drive the African continental free trade area in particular in response to many of these issues. And you're all probably very familiar with the AfCFTA. Some of its processes. I'm sure many of you have in fact been involved at different levels in the discussions that we've seen since really the last 5-6 years. There have been intensive discussions around the African continental free trade area, and it does hold a high level of promise, in my view, to help address many of these challenges that are causing some of the lower levels of intra-African trade, for example, that we see, and some of the problems such as high costs associated with trading goods and services around the continent. So the AfCFTA has been focused on a fairly traditional model of a free trade area, which we will talk about along the lines of what Rob outlined in the first part of today. But I also think that we should really consider that whole initiative as a catalyst for addressing broader challenges as well. I think what we've seen with the AfCFTA process is that it's not just been about trade talks. It's really been a way to garner conversations and momentum around all sorts of issues, such as the improvement of infrastructure. Building cross-border value chains has been another very important thing we're seeing from those AfCFTA processes. And we're seeing quite remarkable progress, to tell you the truth, in developing that agreement. So some of these points are a little bit disputed, but the reality is that to date, we have got fairly low levels of intra-African trade. The estimates do vary greatly depending on what source you look at, and also what you include within those estimates of intra-African trade. But the average tends to be in the range of around 15%, which on that same comparative basis, if you look at Asia, where many of the regional trade arrangements that Rob spoke about have been focused of late, you've got high levels of intra-regional trade there in Asia at 60%, and of course within Europe at 70%. If we unpack those statistics a little bit more and we take out some things such as, for example, the trade of oil products, then we can see that there is, in fact, higher levels of intra-African trade in some of the sectors, including increasingly manufactured products and agricultural-based goods as well. So, as I say, I put that statistic out there, but with a caution, because I do think it is something that can be challenged and debated and discussed. And you may want to do that in your groups as well. I did want to highlight, from a theoretical point of view, what I think has really been the overall approach that we're seeing in the African context to the development of regional trade arrangements. And that is something that has been called developmental integration. And it means that we don't just necessarily focus on traditional market access issues when we're talking about these trade arrangements, but we look further. We look to the pillars that support trade as a whole. So industrialization, the supply side capacity of countries to be able to participate in trade, the infrastructure that bolsters that trade, that allows trade to actually take place, or, for example, the network services infrastructure that's required if you are going to make goods or services and be able to facilitate their movement across borders. And then there's also aspects of governance as well. So I think when we are talking about regional trade linkages, regional trade arrangements in the African context, it has advanced from a much more traditional model, which I think was what we saw in the European approach, where you had the focus on market access in the first instances, to something that is a lot more inclusive of other broader related objectives that link to overall goals around inclusive economic growth in the long term. So in many debates, what we now see, of course, is trade positioned not just for its own right, but as really a tool or a means to achieve these broader objectives, such as industrial development. And so that's I think something really important to bear in mind when you are thinking about how we see these models evolving in the African context. So that's my first section. I see that there are a few people who maybe do want to contribute. I can't quite open the chat whilst I'm sharing my screen, but or I see somebody's got their video on. Would anyone like to ask any questions or raise any points about that first part of the presentation that I've just made?
I can read you the comment from Kolachano in the chat if you want. It was a comment rather than a question, but that intra-regional informal trade dominates trade in Africa. Much of the formal trade data is not well captured by cross-border institutions. Yeah, I would actually fully agree with that. And I certainly think that in specific regions in Africa, you will see higher levels of dominance and importance of the informal sector. We know informally, for example, in the West African context, that there are many informal traders, many informal enterprises operating. And certainly I think the informal nature of trade is really important when we're looking at specific sectors too. So you might see lesser impact of those challenges of capturing informal trade in for example, the trade of pharmaceutical products, which is really a global value chain that is controlled by a handful of very large actors in some instances. But if you're talking about agriculture,
or even clothing and textiles and so on, you're going to have a lot of informal movements. And I think that that's a really important point to take. A lot of what we talk about in courses like this, when we're looking at reflecting on things like the statistics for intra-African trade, very much makes the assumption that we are talking about the formal part of the economy. And that does leave aside a whole lot of people. You know, it's one of the great challenges that many of you, I'm sure, have faced in your own experiences of trying to engage with small and medium-sized enterprises as well as informal actors to discuss things like trade policy or trade agreement negotiations. It's something that is really challenging and really difficult. So thanks for that comment. I think that that's a really important caveat and something to bear in mind when we're talking about these things in the African space.
And then there was a comment from Noma Zulu about the transportation system and disruptions to the movement of goods and services, and you know, issues with trucks being burned down and the loss of loss of product, I suppose, but also the time around that.
Yeah, it's a major cost driver. Noma Zulu's absolutely right. It is you know, the costs of transport and the associated logistics and distribution costs are a major driver of the price of many products that are traded across the African continent. Estimates place it at somewhere between 50 to 60% in Southern Africa in many instances. And the drivers of why those costs are so high are extremely complex to unpack. They range, as pointed out, from things as much as the safety and security situation, driver behavior, the challenges of land-based border post management. All sorts of issues affect those costs. But you know, the unfortunate thing, of course, is that those costs are borne by consumers in the large part. And that is, I think, going to become an increasing factor as we see the global economy and African countries as well entering into a new high inflation level phase. And so I think that those issues are going to become more and more important for policymakers. We will come back to trade facilitation and speak a little bit more about that in the African context in detail as well. I know that Rob's already touched upon it in the previous sessions around the WTO agreements, but it is, I think, one of the main issues that the private sector advocates on and lobbies on when we're talking about how these regional arrangements work. Thanks, Suzanne. So moving on to the second part, I did want to talk a little bit about challenges of regional trade arrangements. And here, as I said, I'm going to make comments that I think would apply in many different parts of the world. And certainly in my experience, they are very relevant to the Pacific region, which I know also Rob would be able to reflect on in great detail as well, but also Asia, Latin America, even within the European Union to some extent as well. But there are some unique points, and one of them is that the African map, if you like, of regional trade arrangements that have been entered into by African countries. So I'm leaving aside here agreements with third parties or countries outside of the continent. I'm looking at the African-based arrangements, and we've got, as you can see, a map where you have quite a lot of overlap between these arrangements. And this map only captures the 8 formally recognized regional economic communities. And as you all know, there are many additional regional arrangements beyond simply the 8 that are recognized by the African Union. And so this problem of overlapping membership has been there for a very long time. It has been an issue in progressing through the stages of integration. For example, it's impossible to belong to more than one customs union. So legally, you just can't manage that. As Rob explained, you've got to have that common external tariff mechanism. And unless you had the exact same common external tariff for multiple customs unions, you would run into all sorts of challenges if you tried to belong to more than one. And so that is one example of why overlapping membership is a problem. And this overlapping membership, I think, was something that was very much at the forefront of the minds of the architects of the African Continental Free Trade Area, who wanted to come up with an overarching agreement that would do away with some of the challenges of overlapping membership. Unfortunately, I think as it's been constructed and as it's emerged, we are going to see a phase where the African Continental Free Trade Area simply plugs some gaps and comes in over the top of the existing regional economic communities, so will not deal with that problem in the short term. But the idea, I think, is still there from a longer term perspective to move to arrangements at a regional level that are not quite so complicated in terms of overlapping membership. Some of the other challenges that I think we see from regional trade agreements in the African context, the top of the list probably for all of them would be the implementation gap, where you've got quite advanced, quite sophisticated arrangements on paper, but there has been challenges and difficulties in moving those from that legal basis, if you like, to real on the ground implementation. This can be for a number of reasons. There are legal reasons why that can be difficult, and that relates to how you translate regional commitments into the domestic systems of the countries that belong to them. This is something that's faced by all sorts of regional trade arrangements around the world. But there's also just sometimes the lack of political commitment, I think, to prioritize regional goals over domestic political ambitions. The nature of our political cycles in many countries is that they're quite short, whereas regional trade initiatives, regional trade arrangements are by their nature often quite long-term in their processes and objectives. There's also a question about who are the beneficiaries of regional integration. And this comes up in many different respects, but also in that kind of tension we see between regional politics and national politics. Is if the beneficiaries of regional integration are viewed to be large firms, for example, then there may be a bit of a pushback that you don't necessarily want to be doing things that are just going to further entrench the power of multinational corporations or transnational corporations in the case of African companies. These companies may have quite a lot of power, but they may not have necessarily positive political capital within certain environments or countries. And I think we don't necessarily have the evidence or understanding of who are the other beneficiaries of regional integration. So that point that Rob makes about trade creation, who actually gets the chance to benefit from that trade creation that we anticipate from these regional trade agreements? And do they actually participate in the processes around ensuring that there is implementation and progress? We see limited monitoring and accountability of many of the regional commitments that are taken. This is in part due to fairly weak secretariats in many instances. There is a tendency for the secretariats of regional trade arrangements, not just in Africa, but everywhere around the world, to be very much seen as simply carrying out the objectives or the wishes of the members of the arrangement, and not having any ability to step outside of the directives of what they're supposed to do. This is a common model. It's effectively the model of the World Trade Organization. In some instances, we see many of the new regional trade arrangements coming forward not having secretariats at all, and simply, for example, rotating the role of secretariat amongst members. In the African context, we do have a challenge of donor dependence also for some of these regional blocks and regional economic communities. That has its challenges. And interestingly, I think what we've also seen over the years is an influence of the actual model of regional engagement from the donors, and particularly European donors here I have in mind. So the European Union itself, but also EU member states. There is no doubt that there has been significant funding provided by the EU and its members for regional projects that reinforce their own model of regional integration. And in some instances, I think that has distorted the areas of priority that perhaps African member states themselves would like to be focusing on versus what the donors are prepared to put money towards. It has resulted in part, I think, in overly ambitious agendas in many ways. That you know, it's the old problem that it's very easy to put an issue onto the agenda of a regional group, but very difficult to take one off. And so you've ended up with work programs, agendas, ambitions that are very wide-ranging in the case of many of these African regional economic communities. And there's probably a lot of argument to be made for actually paring down the focus of many of these initiatives. And of course, there's also a point that I'm quite passionate about, which is that in the case of a number of the regional arrangements we see around the African continent, there's a fairly constrained space for non-state actors to be involved in different ways. And I think that that's important because, particularly if you're thinking of this implementation gap, we all know that trade agreements are, when it comes to their actual benefit, going to be implemented by private sector actors. They're going to be implemented by businesses in many instances. They are about creating at least that environment at the government level for trade to thrive commercially. And so if you don't actually have that degree of communication happening between the actual non-state actors and the government creating that environment for trade, then you can be missing, I think, the focus on things that are really important, such as, for example, transport costs that was raised earlier by one of the participants.
Can I just jump in, Catherine? There were a couple of comments in the chat. One actually relates to exactly what you were just saying from Molise, to Matt, how he said he thinks community involvement in trade, excuse me, in trade policies is important to minimize disruptions to the movement of goods. And then there was a comment from Titus, who's from Zambia, on the challenges of overlapping membership to the regional groupings. And he said that some countries don't actually see this as a challenge, but as an opportunity to benefit from both arrangements that may offer different opportunities. So, for example, Zambia is a member of both SADC and COMESA, and that allows access to both markets.
Absolutely. And I can see that, Titus. That's an interesting point. In terms of if you were talking about free trade areas, I think that makes a lot of sense, and you can definitely see the benefit from the membership of multiple free trade areas, and the case of Zambia is a very good example there. Where it has become, I think, a challenge, as I said, is if you want to progress or deepen your levels of integration to things like customs unions and common markets and so on, then you start to have to be pushed, I think, to make a few more difficult choices about where you're going to align yourself. But what we've seen, I think, emerge over time is that actually the appetite to progress much beyond free trade areas is not really there. And so I agree that in a real world perspective, there may be more benefits to this overlapping participation in different free trade blocks than there are negatives for some countries. And then Mkhonlisi, nice to see you online, and absolutely a good point about the participation of communities. I think that communities definitely are critical actors to support the implementation of trade arrangements. And we also see that they're really important when you start to talk about key issues such as movement of people, which is an aspect that underpins a common market, or further levels of deeper integration. And I think there, if you don't involve your communities, you really begin to experience a lot of difficulties. And so the participation of communities, in addition to sort of the private sector business non-state actors, I think is a really good and important point. What we're seeing in the African continental free trade area experience at the moment is quite interesting in that regard, and that is the move towards having a specific protocol that looks at how entities operated by women and by young people participate in trade specifically, and what are the challenges that they face. And this is going to be quite a unique aspect of the AFCFTA, and in terms of the architecture of it, which I think holds great potential as well for broadening that scope of participation of different stakeholders from different parts of the community as well. If you got me talking about border communities, that's something that I find fascinating in and of itself. When you're looking at the communities that exist around the border posts and the borders of African countries, they can have a massive impact on the trade facilitation of goods and their movement around the continent, and are certainly something that we haven't done enough work on, I think, to address in these considerations of implementation of agreements. So just to wrap up this particular session or set of points, and then to move on to the next ones briefly before we go into our breakouts, I think it's always useful to balance out those challenges that we see happening with regards to regional trade agreements in the continent with also what's really happening on the ground. And the reality, as many of you know, is that with or without legal trade agreements, trade arrangements being put in place, we are going to see activity between neighboring countries. We're going to see activity within certain regions happening. And this is the case anywhere in the world. And certainly when I went back, I couldn't find sort of really up-to-date statistics on this, but some of the trends we saw of investment of African companies in Africa, of mergers and acquisitions between African companies, really indicated, for example, greater types of linkages happening between private sector actors. We've also seen the greater movement of people between African countries over the years as well. And even though that figure of intra-African trade is quite small when we think about it relative to other parts of the world, we are seeing slow levels of growth taking place from that lower base. And that's particularly the case in some of the sub-regions that we focus on, such as East Africa and Southern Africa as well. So I think that there's just always a need to keep in mind both the legal frameworks of these regional trade arrangements, as well as the political, economic, and what's really happening on the ground with the activities of people. So for this last sort of 5-10 minutes before we break up into the groups, I did want to talk about a couple of examples of regional trade arrangements that exist in the African context. But before then, is there any more comments in the chat, Suzanne, on that last section that we should?
There was one comment, Kabuni, he's talking about trade integration and said, I think harmonization of the trade policies, regulations and protocols in the region and even continent and global engagement is the very key for creating a sustainable trade environment for actors to freely participate regardless of the region.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think that comment touches on a few really important things. And one of those is what you will hear from private sector actors all the time. And that is that they really often don't care terribly much exactly what the rules of trade arrangements and trade agreements say, but they do care a lot that they are applied with certainty and that they are not constantly changed and that there is a degree of predictability within the environments. And I think that that's always something that's worth bearing in mind. So, businesses that are engaged in trade can adapt pretty easily to all sorts of different rules. We shouldn't be afraid of that. We shouldn't be afraid of regulating. We shouldn't be afraid of putting in place new arrangements, of negotiating new agreements. But what they always ask for is just be transparent and let us know what the rules are actually going to be for a certain amount of time, because that allows for proper decision making to be made by formal enterprises. So I think that that's a really good point. And the aspects of harmonization are also really important. And it's another area where I think we should not be too harsh on ourselves as well in the African context, because we have got a lot of initiatives underway, not just through the trade agreements themselves, but in other channels that are looking at harmonizing standards, harmonizing regulation. We think about the African Medicines Agency, for example, working in that space. We look at what happens in the intellectual property rights environment, where you have a number of regional intellectual property rights organizations that are working continuously to try and improve the harmonization and application of those regulations. So I think that there are many examples of where we are seeing progress being made, and that's a really critical way that you can also try and bring down some of those costs for trade through harmonization. So very good points there. I think I just want to quickly touch on two examples that highlight a few of the more practical political economy aspects of these regional trade agreements in the African context. One is a customs union, and I've chosen the customs union of Southern Africa, the SACU, the Southern African Customs Union. There is in fact another quite effective customs union in the African context, which is the East African Community. They operate as a customs union as well. There are a number of other blocks that I think, from my point of view, claim to be customs unions, but I would probably say that in the truest legal sense, they're not. I don't believe that ECOWAS is a customs union currently. I think that it has ambitions to be a customs union, but from a practical point of view, it does not operate as a customs union. And in Central Africa as well, I think we see CEMAC operating to a certain extent as a customs union too, but there are limitations to its effectiveness as well. So, I mean, the two customs unions that I think really meet that theoretical construct in the African space are SACU and the East African Community. And this is something that perhaps we could pick up on in your small groups as well, if you want to challenge my view on this. So SACU is the one I've chosen to focus on here. It's got 5 members: Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, South Africa, and I've got Swaziland here. My apologies, it's actually Eswatini, so I need to update my slide there. Eswatini. And it is the oldest customs union in the world, funny enough. And it has quite a unique aspect to it as a result of its history. And that is a revenue sharing formula that's at the heart of this customs union, which reflects not only the distribution of revenue that comes in from trade, from the tariffs collected on goods that are traded by the customs union, but also has an aspect to it which is about the developmental component of that revenue sharing formula, which relates to sharing the benefits of the customs union more widely than just the dominant economy of those 5 countries, which is South Africa. And that revenue sharing formula, as I say, is quite a unique and critical part of the way that the Southern African Customs Union operates. It is a very critical regional trading arrangement for the businesses of Southern Africa. It's completely often taken for granted that SACU does operate as a customs union, that you can move very freely amongst the 5 countries in terms of traded goods and services, and that there are fairly low barriers as well, even at the border posts in most instances too. It is accompanied by a common monetary area that 4 of the 5 countries belong to, with Botswana being the exception there. And that makes quite a big difference as well to the functioning of the customs union. So there is an example of where you've got accompanying levels of regional integration, if you like. You've got a customs union that functions in the trade space. Then you also have a partial monetary union, which is also quite critical to the operations of that Southern African sub-region. There is a lot of work that's underway within SACU continuously around things like industrial development currently, trade facilitation. And as Rob explained, a key part of a customs union is the negotiation as a block of trade agreements. And so SACU has negotiated quite a number of trade agreements as a group now. It has really quite a landmark agreement between the European Union and SACU plus Mozambique, an economic partnership agreement, which is quite extensive. That's also mirrored to a certain extent in an arrangement with the other European countries under the EFTA bloc. So the non-European Union countries who belong to EFTA also have an extensive free trade agreement with SACU, as well as the UK. Which came into force when the UK left the EU. There are 2 other more limited preferential trade agreements, one that's in place with Mercosur countries from Latin America, and a stalled discussion that's been happening with India. And so that just shows you, I think, that SACU does operate quite effectively as a customs union. You will have seen in the media coverage quite recently that there has been conversations underway between America and Kenya. And this is quite a challenge if you think about Kenya as a member of the East African Community, which is a customs union. And how does Kenya go off and start to have bilateral conversations with a third-party trading partner like the Americans without really undermining that whole construct of the East African Community Customs Union? So I see that somebody's flipped ahead of my slides here to the African Continental Free Trade Area. And I'm going to take that as a subtle sign to quickly move to just briefly touch on this.
No, not sure how that happened, Catherine. I don't think any of us can control your slides. So please, you've got plenty of time.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks. Sorry, I don't know quite what was going on then with how they were moving ahead. My apologies. So the example of a free trade area that I wanted to touch upon is COMESA. And I've chosen COMESA simply because it's the largest in in the African context in terms of the existing regional economic communities. It spans a broad area from Eswatini. My apologies to those from Eswatini. I've got Swaziland here again. From Eswatini to Egypt, with its headquarters in Zambia. And so those of you from that region will be very familiar, I'm sure, with COMESA. I think COMESA is quite an interesting example of the shift away from a traditional model of integration. So the COMESA Treaty does reflect very much that approach which Rob outlined in his slides that we see in the European Union case, which is that you have that natural progression from a free trade area to a customs union to a common market to a monetary union and so on. And that's very much what we see mirrored in many of these traditional regional economic communities, including COMESA. But the reality of COMESA, I think, has been that it's done a pretty good job at putting in place a free trade area. But it has not been able to progress much beyond that, to tell you the truth. There's been very little progress in its bid to establish a customs union and a common market. But what I think we need to perhaps say there is that that doesn't take away from everything else it manages to do in terms of encouraging things like harmonization, progressive trade facilitation improvements, joint infrastructure initiatives, and so on. And that's really, I think, what has been at the heart of some of these RECs and why you see them continuing to be really relevant. They have functioning free trade areas like COMESA, like ECOWAS, like SADC, but just because they haven't necessarily been able to progress down that linear path of regional integration doesn't mean that they are not continuing to remain relevant and to see a progress in many different ways. COMESA does, of course, face quite a lot of challenges. I mean, I think from a point of view of its relevance, it's going to be very interesting to see how COMESA continues to remain relevant as we see the ongoing implementation in the longer term of the African Continental Free Trade Area, as well as the Tripartite Free Trade Area, which is something we haven't spoken about directly yet. And also it's been one of those organizations that has suffered at the hands of a deep dependence on donor funding. The members of COMESA have not been able to really match the money that has been put into the organization by donors. And this has led to a lot of, I think, overplaying of certain agenda items and a lack of prioritization. It has also had challenges around staff as a result of the nature of that donor funding as well. So that's just a very sort of brief set of reflections on COMESA, but I think in our breakaway groups, which we'll get into shortly, we would like you to maybe start to think about some of these issues for those types of organizations that you've got experience with and have had interactions with in terms of your own country's regional agendas. So before I get into the African Continental Free Trade Area briefly, Suzanne, is there any other points in the chat that you wanted to mention?
No, not at the moment.
Okay, great. Anybody want to raise a hand? And
One just came in. So
oh,
said that.
great.
Well, you see again. The large economies such as the US, China, the EU are disruptive to these regional trade agreements because they want our countries to consume their goods by enforcing the rules-based system. Our goods are neglected and our own businesses don't have the profit, and unemployment and poverty will continue while the large economies benefit.
Oh, that's a mouthful, Khaleesi. And I think there's some points in there that I would agree with, but I think there's also some points in there that we could unpack as well. I think the relationship between global powers and Africa as a continent and its regional blocks is a really interesting one, because we have very much seen the sort of the diplomacy of these large global trading powers in the African context about a kind of a collective umbrella often, and I'm thinking here of things like FOCAC, the Forum on Africa-China Cooperation. I'm thinking about the US-Africa Business Summits, the EU-Africa Summits, even the India-Africa Summits, you know, Turkey, Africa, everybody's had a summit with Africa, right? So you have that overarching collective sort of diplomacy approach there. But then the reality is that the interactions that take place at a commercial level are very much governed by bilateral interactions between African countries as individual markets and those others. You know, you even saw that reflected in the way that the European Union chose to configure its negotiations of the economic partnership agreements, and why we have only really one final and complete economic partnership agreement across the whole of the continent. And so, you know, I think you've got this disjunction, this disconnect between those high level continental diplomatic type initiatives that take place and have those big sort of fancy meetings and outcomes versus the way that you then really deal with commercial issues, which is bilaterally. And I think that that's something that is enabling African countries to still be divided and ruled, for want of a better term, as you imply in your comment. And so I don't know if that kind of makes much sense, but that's one of the things that kind of bothers me a little bit, and that I think is part of the contribution to some of the challenges you're mentioning. There's also going to be challenges around just sheer implementation of these regional arrangements so that the beneficiaries of them are African businesses. And so this is one of the challenges we're going to see, I think, when we come to the African Continental Free Trade Area, is going to be the capacity administratively of African countries to ensure that there's not imports coming from, particularly, I would say, China and India and other Asian producers coming into the continent duty-free and benefiting from these regional arrangements because of things like transshipment or misdeclaration of origin, misinterpretation of the origin rules, all of these things, which are quite complex and require high degrees of administrative capacity to monitor and implement. So I think you've also got technical issues. So you've got political issues, got technical issues, and then of course you've just got the nature of African economies, African private sector, and what is made, what is able to be traded, and the focus of manufacturers and traders on getting the best money that they can. And sometimes that's not through trading with your neighbors. So yeah, you've got all sorts of issues in the mix, I think, to unpack in that comment. So I haven't done it justice, but hopefully some of those points are a bit of a response to your thinking there as well around these issues. So Suzanne, I just want to check on timing. Should I move into talking about the African Continental Free Trade Area now, or would you like to take a bit of a break and go into the breakout groups first? What's your preference?
I'm quite happy either way, Catherine. Yeah, maybe we'll go into the breakout rooms and then you can have a bit of a break as well, and they can have a chat with each other.
Yeah, maybe start to come back and unpack some of the issues that we've been touching upon in the other regional arrangements, and then we can talk about the African Continental Free Trade Area in the last remaining part of today's session. Okay,
that sounds good. So I will open the breakout rooms, and then I'll share the question that Rob has drafted with the breakout rooms. Okay, welcome back everyone. Hopefully that was better in terms of time. for you. So can we hear from group 1? Berhanu, Kirti, Mankope, Mojibola, Titus.
Kia ora.
Kia ora, Titus.
Indeed. Speaking on behalf of Group 1, our membership was Ethiopia, Mauritius, Nigeria, South Africa, and Zambia. And discussion was as follows. With regard to trade agreements, regional, multilateral, bilateral, the benefits that we have seen were lined up as follows. One, general access to an otherwise larger market. And one example was, well, the example I had given earlier about overlapping membership, which gives us an access to about a population of 1 billion in Africa, which our country is only 20 million people. So obviously access to a larger market. Trade agreements give us easier access, easier passage of goods, services, and also for people, because other components of these agreements include waiver of visas, which allows easy flow for people. Tariff reductions, tax incentives, and other benefits that end up resulting in increased exports and increased revenues for a country. Those were some of our benefits. When it comes to the challenges that we have experienced in our various countries, the impact on local producers and the impact on their ability to compete with larger firms from either the region or other parties of the agreements, that has been a challenge. For certain regional, yes, there is an improvement in trade, but the pressure that it adds on the infrastructure of a certain country, and the example was given on the pressure that South Africa is facing on its roads, increased trade to be able to access other countries results in pressure on that particular country's infrastructure. When it comes to negotiation of these trade agreements, there's a potential of unequal power. Where there's unequal power, there's a potential for one party benefiting more than the other and taking advantage of that agreement. We went on further to sort of propose what the way forward would be. And we see that most African countries are, our economies are geared towards one resource. If it's oil, then mainly our economy is geared towards oil. If it's whatever product, copper. So expansion would help in terms of our ability to trade and our ability to take advantage of such agreements. Reforms in our economies would help. And also there was a suggestion for an embracing of artificial intelligence and technology in our doing of business. That was our discussion as Group 1.
Thank you, Titus. I think Berhanu was in your group and maybe dropped out. So has added his views in the chat on Ethiopia's trade agreement benefits and issues. But Ethiopia has signed various trade agreements with different countries to promote economic growth and increase foreign investment. These agreements have the potential to benefit Ethiopia by expanding market access, increasing exports, and attracting foreign investment. However, there are also some challenges and issues, including the potential for unequal power dynamics, as you said, in negotiations, the risk of losing control over domestic industries, and the potential for negative impact on local producers and workers. Overall, it is important for Ethiopia to carefully consider the potential benefits and drawbacks of each trade agreement and negotiate from a position of strength to ensure that the country's interests are protected. So thank you, Berhanu. Group 2, David Duduzile, Isaac Lesedi.
Good morning, it's Duduzile here.
Good
Giving
morning.
a report for Group 2. We are made up of Ghana, Botswana, and South Africa. Oh, my Wi-Fi is unstable. I'm just going to stop my video, sorry. So we just, I'll start with some of the issues that we've had because the issues came across as quite being common across. So we spoke about the bottlenecks in the various forms of corruption, politically, there's a lack of commitment and consistency with change of leadership. Means also that there's a change of direction as to where the focus will be. The corruption at your borders and your ports from your government officials. This affects your small and medium enterprises as well. They're being taken advantage of because they don't necessarily have all the current information regarding customs agreements, are subject to paying bribes, and that ends up forcing the enterprises to remain at a smaller sphere, preventing them from actually growing. We also have challenges on unit costs of goods across borders, which makes the goods quite expensive. And politically, there's a main focus on potential of an agreement rather than actual value add. And this also slows trade between the regional bodies. Then some of the benefits that we've actually outlined as well is that Ghana, for example, has bilateral agreements with the EU, the UK, and Northern Ireland. So direct trade with them is a benefit because of the reduced tariffs for imports in comparison to the imports that they receive from the US, which are still subject to your ECOWAS external tariffs. We also had input that since Ghana is also the secretary for AFTA, it gives them access to international markets. And they participate more in the preferential free trade agreement section. We have input also from Botswana saying that as their participation in SACU, being a landlocked country means the no customs duty for the movement of goods, as well as their own direct bilateral agreements with the EU, allowing for the ease of imports of goods, specifically agricultural goods. From South Africa, we also said that larger enterprises can leverage the trade agreements with many other countries to gain access to a larger market. And yeah, I think I'm not sure if I've left anything out, colleagues, but yeah, basically we're saying that yes, the trade agreements are great. It allows, it enables access to international markets, and we can also improve product quality. However, the drawbacks are quite substantive, and that is why we're not able to resolve issues like your poverty, your inequality, and such. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, really, it's very interesting. And I mean, you mentioned corruption as well. It's something that we haven't really had time to talk about, but that is obviously, yeah, a challenge. So thank you. Group 3, Kabuni, Nomazulu, William. I think there must have been others in that group that we may have lost.
Okay, good morning, it's Nomazulu speaking. I'm presenting on behalf of Group 3. I think that most of the points have been mentioned. Just to mention that on the trade agreements, most countries have got more than one agreement that they are part of. So that makes it more beneficial, although there are some challenges that come with it. But generally, this has widened the market share that different countries can reach in terms of marketing their products. I think the second point would be the knowledge sharing amongst the countries, because when you trade, there's a certain expectation in terms of the goods that you must receive from another country. So they tend to share information on how to ensure the good quality of the product. And sometimes when your products are rejected, you tend to up your game and ensure that it is actually suitable for that particular market. I think on the issues, the one thing that we mentioned is more competitive countries due to their stronger currency, which is affecting the other countries. You might find out one currency is stronger than that of another trading partner. So the country with a strong currency is at an advantage. There's also mistrust among participating countries. Some countries are being blamed for dominance by their trading partners, despite them being in this agreement. And also there's lack of transparency at times, countries tending to hide some of some information from the others, and this is actually affecting this agreement. In terms of e-commerce, some countries are behind in terms of using e-commerce. For example, Kenya is ahead amongst its trading countries. So you find out that other countries, they are struggling with technology and also interest levels. So they are not able to trade or to fully maximize the agreement because they can't use such platforms as e-commerce. And then in the case of countries that are landlocked, that tend to move their goods within countries that have access to ports, putting pressure on the roads, damaging the infrastructure of the countries where they pass by. For instance, Botswana has to come through either Namibia or South Africa for them to be able to move their goods. So this actually puts pressure at the borders and also on the roads, affecting the infrastructure of the neighboring countries. And then the last part is the political and economic will, which is a challenge, at times leading to disputes and conflicts amongst countries, which is also affecting these agreements. And countries are not fully benefiting as a result of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point about the pressure on infrastructure. And I mean, you know, how can you sort of build up your infrastructure to the point where it is actually, you know, fit for purpose for actually moving what you need to move. Thank you. Room 4, Adil, Belasco, Seth.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So in group 4, we had Zimbabwe, South Africa, Zambia, and Ghana. So much of these countries, we are from the Southern Africa. So most of the points that I'll speak out, they will resonate within this region. So basically, we've come to understand that the advantages of trade agreements in such our region, they increase access to larger markets for our exports, which can lead to increased sales and revenue for the region. Also, in addition, we also benefit from increased competition, as it may incentivize local producers to improve the product and services to meet international standards. Moreover, we also saw that the trade agreement increased the foreign investment as a result of these agreements to make investments which stimulate growth and create job opportunities. I'll quickly go to the main issues, the problems which arise from these trade agreements. So in the Southern Africa region, we noticed that much of the issues are emanating from Zimbabwe. I should say personally, because I'm from Zimbabwe, because you see, there was an issue which happened in year 2000 in the First Republic of Zimbabwe when the former president Robert Mugabe imposed the Land Reform Act when he was taking ownership of the land from the white people, giving it to the back to the black people. So because of such an act, it attracted heavy sanctions on the country when United States imposed what we know as ZEDERA. What we know as ZEDERA. So ZEDERA is an act which was imposed by United States in 2001 after the Land Reform Act targeting economic sanctions on Zimbabwe. So because of that, this has heavily impacted the region, because now for trade to thrive well, it is difficult because one of the countries is heavily sanctioned. So this has affected the region so much, up to an extent where you would see that countries like South Africa, they are affiliated more with America. South Africa, Eswatini, they are more affiliated with America, and Zimbabwe now, because it's sanctioned with America, is now more affiliated with China. So now they take what we call the Look East policy. Zimbabwe is taking the Look East policy, while South Africa is taking the Look West policy. So these issues, they impact a lot. If you take a good look at South Africa, it is thriving well in the motor industry. They are able to assemble cars, they are able to manufacture, while Zimbabwe is unable, and Zambia, they are able to assemble those things. So at the end of the day, you would find that some countries are importing cars from Japan, second-hand cars, while the other country next to them is manufacturing. So these imbalances, we've read that some of them are emanating from the politics. So I would say that the sanctions, they've been criticized a lot by a lot of African countries. But the issue now, when they get to the United Nations, they are scared to voice out their issues because they are scared of the big brother, which is America. Right now, Africa, we do not have a permanent seat in the security in the United Nations. So lack of partnership and support within member states is also another thing that is affecting trade within countries. So yeah, that is all that we managed to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, that is all. That's a lot. Yeah. So those sanctions are still fully in place.
Yes, they're still in place.
Wow.
Because the issue is the America feel that the current government or the political power that is in place is not honoring the human rights, and they feel that the Land Reform Act, which was done in year 2000, was not a proper thing to do, to take land from the white minority back to the black majority. So I would say the past 2 decades, it has been very difficult for the country to economically thrive. So that's why currently, if you heard, there is an issue which is trending, the issue of the gold mafia, where Zimbabwe illicit gold trading, gold is being taken out of the country, sent to Dubai, because now Zimbabwe is unable to trade its gold on the world market. So they are now using other underground schemes to take their gold to trade with countries like Dubai. That is why I said earlier, Zimbabwe is taking the Look East policy to trade with the Arabs, the Chinese. So now America is really disturbed by that. Why is Zimbabwe taking its gold underground to trade with Arabs and China? You see, those are some of the issues which are trending.
That's fascinating. Thank you. Last group, Atal, Malisi, Santo. It was group 5, by the way.
Morning, colleagues. Good afternoon. Good evening.
Afternoon, morning, evening.
Because we have different time zones. Okay, in our group with South Africa, Eswatini, and Uganda, Ethiopia. So most of the issues that have already been discussed in the previous groups, but I'll just mention a few, the benefits. We have agricultural benefits in all these countries, metal, fisheries, livestock, road infrastructure development, access to EU market, sugar, revenue sharing from and increase of export and import. Issues we've got seasonal food challenges, and other countries will not allow export when they don't have food. We've got political disputes in goods, maintenance of transport, corruption, roadblocks everywhere for bribes, exploitation of documents, delaying of goods in our borders, and dispute of list of goods so that one must pay money for that you can have a pass. We've got challenges of double taxation of goods. We've got visa issues. We've got price fluctuation of petrol and diesel that have impact on price inflation. We've got problem also of road infrastructure, a non-function of African Union to coordinate these regions? Thanks.
Thank you. Not to mention the load shedding that you're currently dealing with. We're stage 8 now. Thank you all very much for your feedback and your insights. It's fascinating to hear from all of you. So for the last part, I'm going to hand back to Catherine.
Right. Let me just share my screen again with you all. Okay, thanks very much. And yeah, really interesting input from the different groups there, and obviously some similar challenges. The $1 million question, I guess, is always how you can overcome some of these. And one of the initiatives that we currently have on the table to bring African countries closer together and to at least have forums and ways to discuss many of the trade issues as well as the trade related issues is the African Continental Free Trade Area. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about in these last 20 minutes or so that we've got now. Okay, right. So most of you, I'm sure, are pretty familiar with the AFCFTA and what it looks like. It certainly has been top of mind, I think, for most African trade negotiators over the last 6-7 years. And it is, in fact, going to form the largest trade agreement in the world when it's concluded. It's going to be, that's in terms of the number of countries participating, which is a potential set of countries at the moment of 54, with Eritrea being the outlier that hasn't yet signed the AFCFTA. But in theory, they would also be very welcome to join the free trade area too. So it could be 55 countries. And given the size of this market, given the complexities of negotiating with that many countries, I think in many ways, there's been quite remarkable progress of the AFCFTA since the negotiations were initiated in 2016. And especially when we take into account the fact that many of those negotiations had to take place during the years of COVID, travel restrictions and lockdowns and so on as well. And that was in and of itself a challenge for trade negotiators to come to grips with, was using new forms of technology and so on to be able to interact and talk about really quite challenging issues. So where have we got to with the AFCFTA and what's going on? So the way that the agreement was originally structured was in phases for the negotiations. The first phase was intended to cover trade in goods and trade in services. And those protocols, those parts of the free trade area agreements have largely been concluded. And technically, trade of some products was possible from the 1st of January 2021. But we'll talk a little bit about why that actually hasn't necessarily happened as yet. Then there was phase 2 of the negotiations, which were about trade-related issues to be captured in protocols relating to investment, intellectual property rights, competition policy, and then electronic commerce or digital trade was added to that phase as well. We've also seen an additional protocol being put onto the agenda of the negotiators, and that relates to the issues faced by women and youth traders. I did want to just note an interesting aspect about the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which is the adjustment fund that we've seen established in the last few months as well. And this is a mechanism where there will be monies made available to member states that qualify for assistance to offset the financial implications of implementing the free trade area. This goes to some of the points that Rob was making at the outset about trade diversion and trade creation, but it also goes to acknowledging that quite a few African countries to different degrees rely on tariffs as a source of revenue still. And this is particularly the case, I think, for some of the smaller landlocked African countries as well. The tariffs can play quite a big part in their revenue pool for the country as a whole. And so if by lowering the tariffs under the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, they see a reduction in that revenue, then they can apply for financing from this adjustment fund that's been established with a base in Rwanda. And so I think that that's an interesting aspect that we've seen coming into play related to the AFCFTA that I just wanted to mention. So what does this actually look like? I wanted to give you a little bit of the technicalities, just because I think it's useful to have this sort of technical sense of the language that is used in these regional trade agreements, as well as some sort of sense of how the AFCFTA is going to evolve and be implemented in the different phases and in the different aspects of it. So when we look at trade in goods, which, as I mentioned, is part of that first phase, the overall objective of the AFCFTA was to create a space where 90% of all products, 90% of the tariff lines that are captured in the tariff schedules of a country will move with no duties. So again, thinking back to those slides Rob showed you at the beginning about the preferential nature of trade and removing those duties, the idea is that this will be done in the case of the AFCFTA for 90% of goods. This would enable it to also meet that WTO criteria of credibility, if you like, or the requirement under the WTO agreement of covering essentially all trade. That does allow for countries or customs unions to carve out up to 10% of goods for sensitive reasons. So 7% of those can have a longer implementation period, and 3% can actually be excluded from coverage under the free trade area completely. So there are those three categories. Category A, the 90% that will be liberalized to 0% duties, 7% that will take a longer period to implement and come down to 0, and then 3% excluded. The other aspect of this agreement and what has been taking, I think, the longest time in the context of trade and goods is rules of origin. And rules of origin matter in regional trade arrangements because that's what determines the products that are given those preferential tariff rates. We have to know where a product comes from. We have to know its declared source of origin in order to determine whether it should be charged a tariff rate of, say, 20%, or whether it should come in with 0 duties. This is a critical aspect of also protecting the participation in regional trade agreements from countries that may not be intended to be beneficiaries, but could, indirectly benefit if they were able to transship their goods or indirectly meet these rules of origin. We don't want to do that. We want to see this agreement benefiting African producers, as was raised, I think, in one of the comments a bit earlier on today. So those rules of origin take quite a long time to work out because the African Continental Free Trade Area decided to take an approach of having specific rules of origin for each product. This is an incredibly intensive process to go through. It's not the only option for negotiating rules of origin. There are other systems that operate in African regional economic communities where, for example, you would have a banded system where you'd have a baseline rule that applies to a certain category of products. But in the AFCFTA context, it was decided that there would be specific rules for each product. And so it's become quite problematic in resolving issues related in particular to automotives and clothing and textiles, which still have not been concluded in the negotiations. And this delay in agreeing of rules of origin has really been one of the main reasons we have seen that there has not been a lot of trade yet under the African Continental Free Trade Area. Because if you don't have in place your rules of origin, if you then don't also have in place your new tariff commitments, and you don't have in place your administrative arrangements from a customs point of view, then you can't have trade of a preferential nature happening. So there is an initiative now underway, supported by the AFCFTA Secretariat and some donors, called the Guided Trade Initiative. And the aim there is to really encourage this commercially meaningful trade to start happening under the AFCFTA. It's going to matchmake businesses in different markets, and it's going to also help test the required institutional and operational systems for implementation. Then there's also trade and services, which was part of phase one of this process as well. And trade and services is a really different area of not only negotiations, but also implementation of regional trade agreements. It requires a whole range of different actors to be involved beyond just your trade officials. And sometimes I think there's even a perception of whether in fact activities are classified even as trade and services because of their nature, their overlap with things like infrastructure investment, and in the case these days increasingly of digital trade as well and electronic commerce. So you've got a very kind of complex set of issues in the trade and services space. And the way that the AFCFTA was structured was to break this down to focus in the first instance on 5 priority areas of services. So they were business services, communications, finances, tourism, transport. These were seen to be critical parts of the service network around the continent, and they were the priorities. And there has been quite good progress made. We now, certainly at the end of 2022, had offers from 21 countries that were provisionally agreed to. There were offers from about 45 countries in total, but not all of them had yet been agreed at the end of last year. And so in theory, we will be moving ahead with services commitments that address issues related to market access, as well as most favored nation treatment as well. So this is an area where I think we're going to be seeing a lot more work and a lot more progress being made in terms of trade capacity, trade implementation moving forward in the African context as well. So the AFCFTA, I think, has to be viewed in my mind as a long-term project. I think that there has been a sort of a disconnect in some ways between the political rhetoric around launching this thing and continuously trying to push it ahead, which has been beneficial to a certain extent in terms of progressing the negotiations. But it has also led to a sense of confusion on the other side from the private sector, who have never been quite sure whether this thing is actually in force or not. The benefits are all clear, but we really do have to make sure that we have the systems in place that can implement the arrangement, that will set out how it relates to other regional trading agreements in Africa and how it will be monitored, enforced, and implemented going forward. So that's some of the key points I wanted to touch on with regards to the AFCFTA. It is it's a world-class agreement, and it has been quite a complex process to negotiate. I would make the comment that it does build very much on existing trade commitments that African countries have made who belong to the World Trade Organization. So when we think about these regional trading agreements, we come back to the points that Rob was making at the beginning of this session, which is that they tend to build from the WTO and go from there. And the AFCFTA is no exception in that regard. It has gone WTO plus, which is what we would say in a number of areas. And it has gone outside of the WTO in relation to things like adding the protocol around youth and women, which is getting ahead of the WTO agenda that we currently see in this area. So there is a lot, I think, that we are familiar with in the AFCFTA. There's also a lot that builds on the existing regional economic communities. The key for it going forward is going to be whether it will facilitate the other aspects that are critical for making regional trade agreements work, those points that you all raised now in the breakaway groups. How do we really address those on the ground challenges, such as infrastructure, such as costs, such as tax, such as corruption? All of these kind of points that were raised that relate to trade and that are really going to make the difference at the end of the day. So I would want to maybe wrap it up there just to allow a last few minutes, Suzanne, for any questions and any discussion around the AFCFTA that people might want to have rather than starting on a new section at this point in time. So I don't know if we've got anybody who wants to ask about the African Continental Free Trade Area or comment perhaps on how they see this particular initiative. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. Yeah, but feel free to put it in the chat if your internet's a bit wonky, or just turn on your mic and jump in. Were there any comments or questions?
Everybody understanding and on top of the AFCFTA and what it means?
Seems like it. Obviously, yes. You were very clear, Catherine. I mean, what you could potentially do is just skip ahead a couple of slides to the example of the AFCFTA and how to use it.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that we have included in the slides, and I don't know if how many of you are involved in communicating or engaging around discussions within your own countries about these types of trade agreements, but this is a way that I find really helpful in trying to encourage greater discussion between businesses and government officials around these types of issues. Some of these points you might want to think about if you are engaging, particularly with your private sector or even other community groups about regional trade agreements or bilateral trade agreements of any kind. And how you can think about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and any other one, we're just using the AFCFTA here as an example, is often from thinking about first, what type of business are you talking to or are you engaging with? Because depending on how the business is placed, it will have an impact on their view of a trade agreement. I think this was something that came up in the discussion about benefits versus challenges. As you're going to have parts of your private sector that are beneficiaries of these types of arrangements, and then you're also going to have perhaps those that are more threatened or likely to see perhaps negative implications. So if you're an importer, for example, you could think about whether the regional trade arrangement or the AFCFTA in this case would in fact erode your market share. Would there be more competition coming into this marketplace because of the reduction in tariffs or the preferential tariff rates and the removal of restrictions in terms of non-tariff barriers and so on. So competition is a key aspect here from a business point of view. If you're a local manufacturer, you're also going to be interested in competition. You're going to be wanting to monitor potential new imports coming into your market, and maybe also thinking about where you can connect to value chains or supply chains. So if, for example, you are manufacturing using particular inputs, you may be sourcing those from outside of the African continent at the moment, but with these new preferential tariff rates under the AFCFTA, you could consider looking at exchanging your source of inputs and exploring possibilities of connecting more to other African providers. And then, of course, if you're an exporter, which tends to be the more intuitive way to think about beneficiaries of trade agreements, is where are the opportunities for you to grow your export base, and how would you do that? And there you can start to ask yourself some of these questions. You know, are you going to be able to benefit from the preferential rates of duty under this agreement? And what would you need to put in place to do that? So very kind of practical things can start to then come out of considering a trade agreement in this way. Understanding whether you've got the correct tariff scheduling and so forth in place with your customs. How does the certificates of origin process work? How do you prove you meet the origin requirements? And then are there any other administrative requirements in your particular jurisdiction? So these are all the types of very practical questions that we've set out here. And I think, as I say, this might be a helpful way for those of you who engage with private sector stakeholders or stakeholders outside of governments to try and bridge that gap between the theoretical legal frameworks for regional trade agreements and the actual implementation on the ground by business. And that's just the key point we wanted to get to in these particular slides. So I hope you get a chance to take a look at them and maybe think about that, and would be very happy to come back to these points as well in a later session if they prompt any questions or comments from participants. Thanks, Suzanne.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Was there any last comments? We're pretty much bang on time. Excellent work. Oh, Titus has put one in the chat. My general comment, well, thanks, Catherine. Thank you, Titus. My general comment is that while Africa's been making efforts towards this integration, the recent developments like the falling apart of the North American trade agreement under Trump, the EU challenges at Brexit, and the lessons from the recent closure by most countries during the pandemic sort of cast a shadow on efforts. I mean, I would 100% agree with that, and yet at the same time sort of feel like that's why agreements like this are even more important. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the thing, isn't it? Is funny enough, I think, Titus, you're so right about your points, and it's one of the reasons we have seen renewed interest, including from countries like New Zealand, for example, in supporting the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, because it is a shining light against all of the things you've mentioned there, as an attempt by a group of developing countries to really push ahead with a world-class agreement that not only will create a strong regional initiative, but also lends itself to bolstering the multilateral trading system at the same time. And I think we've been short on those types of processes in recent years. So it has lent itself to be supported strongly by those countries with an interest in multilateralism, with an interest in a strong global trading order that is rules-based. And one of the initiatives, just to give a bit of a plug to some of the things New Zealand has been thinking about in this regard, just so you can see the interest, is I've been working with the New Zealand Foreign Ministry as well, looking at how we can support businesses to benefit from the AFCFTA in an African context. And we're going to be supporting an accelerator for agribusinesses, who are looking to expand and grow to become cross-border traders under the AFCFTA. So I think that it's one of those things that, yes, it's a difficult environment out there in which to be pushing ahead with these types of initiatives, but there's also still a lot of support for the principles, for the objectives of it, and for the overall benefits that these types of regional agreements can bring in the long term. It's not a short-term project, it's a long-term project.
Absolutely, Africa leading the world. Right, so we are at time, so I just wanted to say thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you so much, Rob, ngā mihi nui. Thank you so much to all of our amazing scholars for your contributions as well. Oh, Mojibola. Did you have your hand up?
Oh, hi, hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
Okay, I just wanted to thank the facilitator of today's session, Ms. Catherine. Our session on the AFCTA was quite insightful. And for us in Nigeria, seeing that we signed like 2 years back, it's really going to be useful for us to, you know, make use of the AFCTA agreement rather than always doing bilateral trade agreements, especially for like the ECOWAS regional states rather. So I'm really looking forward to a slide so I could really digest it very well. Thank you. And I wanted to ask, how do you say happy birthday in Maori? Because today's my birthday.
Oh, well, we would say Rafano. So yes, happy birthday, Rafano to you from all of us here. So you can also say Hari Harato.
Thank you.
So have a great day. I would just quickly close with a
Happy birthday,
karakia.
Mojibola.
Thank you. Thank you.
Kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te aio, te aroha me te maruto, tihe mori ora. And yeah, Rafano, happy birthday. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Stay safe, be well, and we will see you back here next week. And Rob and Catherine will be back next week as well. So yeah, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you and bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Enjoy the
Bye,
rest of your
guys. Okay.
Bye.